So the power of diet is incontrovertible. What is the extent of that power? Well, it reverberates to within the double helix of DNA. You all remember the excitement as we entered the genomic age, and we were going to have everybody's genome mapped, and the idea was we'd find what's broken in our genes and engineering would fix it. And of course, none of that panned out. Because very few of the diseases that most plague modern societies are monogenic. In other words, there isn't just a gene responsible for heart disease. It's a whole suite of genes that put you at risk. And the same for diabetes and obesity and dementia. So we have moved on from the notion that DNA is destiny, but we've also moved into the epigenetic era where we recognize that 95% of chromosomal real estate is not genes. 5% is genes. 95% is the epigenome. And the epigenome basically is a vast complex of levers and switches baked into our chromosomes that control what our genes do. And what controls what the epigenome does? Our diet and lifestyle. DNA is not destiny. Dinner is. Because what we eat at dinner, lunch, breakfast, snacks, our activity, our environments, our overall health, and the formula I like to talk about is feet, forks, fingers. I already talked about those, right? So physical activity, dietary pattern, avoiding toxins like tobacco, excess alcohol. The rest of the formula is sleep. We need enough. Stress, we have to avoid too much. And love, strong social connections. Feet, forks, fingers, sleep, stress, love. The six-cylinder engine of lifestyles medicine, that is destiny. Because that formula will alter the output of your very genes. We can change gene expression when we change our behavior and lifestyle. Dinner is destiny. So the power of diet doesn't stop where DNA begins. It insinuates itself there. And speaking of chromosomal architecture, we actually know that lifestyle can change that too. The very composition of the chromosomes. So these green caps here at the ends of these chromosomes are telomeres. And you've likely heard that telomeres are one of the more potent correlates of healthy lifespan. The longer your telomeres, the longer healthy life is likely to be. I say likely because you can have long telomeres. It's still a really bad idea to stand in front of a moving train, for example. But other things being equal, long telomeres means long, healthy life, not just living long and prospering with vitality. Longevity plus vitality. Telomeres predict that. And in research associated with the Nobel Prize in Medicine for Elizabeth Blackburn at UCSF, it's been shown that lifestyle interventions can actually lengthen telomeres. And the lead author of this paper is a good friend to this audience and a good personal friend of mine, Dean Ornish. Really important work. So we can lengthen our telomeres. So we're starting to understand the intracellular mechanisms by which diet and lifestyle can translate into longevity and vitality. So, I've devoted my career to all of this, but I also got sucked into the vortex of pandemic response. I wrote an op-ed that ran in the New York Times. I wound up speaking to a couple of governors. I testified before the Senate Homeland Security Committee all in the past year. I was on every media outlet you can imagine. Maybe some of you saw me. Became quite friendly with Tom Friedman, the longtime columnist at the New York Times and three-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and he and I collaborated on many of his columns. And one of the messages I wanted to get out from the very beginning, and you can see how long ago this was February of last year, was that there already was a pandemic before we ever heard about SARS-CoV-2. We weren't waiting for a pandemic. We were in a pandemic. We were in a pandemic of bad diet, bad lifestyle, chronic disease. And however big the COVID-19 pandemic proves to be, and we didn't know back then, this was a year ago, February, however big it proves to be, it's not going to be as big as the pandemic of diet-induced obesity and chronic disease, because that's beyond the scale of any infectious disease pandemic, because it's every year forever. It's been going on for decades, and just taking innumerable years from lives and life from years. So what about that? Because that is almost certainly going to translate into a greater toll in the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, because it's not good to get an infectious disease while already sick. And an awful lot of Americans, and for that matter, people all around the world, are already sick. This is a crucial time to think about health promotion. This is a crucial time to think about improving diet, physical activity, and lifestyle as a means of fortifying ourselves against this pandemic. Alas, I was whistling into the wind. Hardly anybody's talked about this. Not the former administration, not the current administration. The idea that this is the perfect time for a national "Let's Get Healthy Together" campaign didn't catch on. I did what I could. I waved the flag. I made as much noise. But this fell into a socio-political blind spot because, coronary artery disease is a rite of passage in America. Nobody even notices. It's expected that at a certain age, you're going to have a stent or a bypass or angioplasty. It's just a given. Type 2 diabetes, geez, everybody gets that eventually, right? Hypertension, you get old enough, you have hypertension. There's no way to avoid that. I mean, that's how we think. These things are just expected to happen. And so it's fine that, we have animal food centric diets. It's fine that multicolored marshmallows are part of a child's complete breakfast. It's not fine. Our culture tells us it's all fine, it's all good, it's all normal. It's not fine, it's sure not good, it shouldn't be normal, you should be outraged. But this has direct implications for the mess we're in right now, because the massive toll of SARS-CoV-2 in the United States is mightily driven by our very poor cardiometabolic health coming into this pandemic. So colleagues and I went beyond just making noise in the media. We did some papers in the peer-reviewed literature, including this one in the Journal of Emerging Infectious Diseases, where we looked at the distribution in the US population of conditions that had already been identified as leading indicators of bad COVID outcomes. You're more likely to get hospitalized or wind up in the ICU or die if you have the following. And our findings indicated that 6 out of 10 American adults had at least one of these bad things. 4 out of 10 had 2 or more. So again, every way at our disposal, we were making noise about this. Come on, let's do something about this. That paper that we published was picked up by Nadia Popovich at the New York Times, who actually took it a step further and talked about how in communities of color, there really was a perfect storm because you had a high burden of obesity and chronic disease before SARS-CoV-2 because you had basically food swamps and food deserts. So in environments that were conducive to eating badly, maybe environments where it wasn't safe to exercise outdoors. So, environments basically that conspired against cardiometabolic health. So high burdens of obesity, chronic disease, bad eating. And then many of the people living in disadvantaged neighborhoods are essential workers. So they're the very ones who couldn't stay home when the virus was circulating in the early going. So they have to go to work and be exposed. These were also neighborhoods often subject to severe stress because of racial injustice and other forms of social injustice. Perfect storm. And so what we've seen throughout the pandemic is these neighborhoods where there is a combination of disadvantages economically, demographically, have been hit terribly hard and suffered the greatest losses. So this at least got some attention in the New York Times, although we've not gone a long way towards fixing the problem. And obesity all by itself, which of course is a direct product of 2 things, obviously too many calories in, too few calories out, but overwhelmingly this is due to poor diets. Obesity is really the leading explanation for bad COVID outcomes in younger people. So this has huge relevance, not just across time, but at this time. We're living together, my friends, through a very unusual moment in history. It's been a very strange year we've all been through, and we're not quite out of the woods yet, although very close. We certainly can see the light at the end of the tunnel now. But we have to talk about that, and we have to look at the general status of our priorities and our approach to diet and lifestyle and health, and line all that up against what's going on right now. And the verdict is not good. We had a tremendous opportunity to mitigate the harms of this pandemic in many ways and failed to take advantage. So this is now getting more attention. There are other publications by other authors. Obesity seems to be one of the main explanations for massive differentials in mortality rates among countries around the year. And again, we have one of the worst. And not surprising because we have one of the highest rates of obesity anywhere in the world. When my colleague Mary Adams looked at this, we saw much the same, and this is on the preprint server, not yet in the peer-reviewed literature, but we found marked differentials in COVID-related outcomes associated with obesity. And I saw this when I was on the front lines. I volunteered on the front lines during the surge in New York City just over a year ago, or maybe it was just exactly a year ago. I wound up being deployed in the Bronx in an emergency department. I saw patients for 30 years. I stopped seeing patients several years ago to focus on the public health aspects of my career, but I came out of clinical retirement. I'm still a licensed physician to volunteer and help out. And when I was on the front lines dealing with COVID exclusively, I saw the effects of cardiometabolic ill health. The people who were severely ill, we saw a lot of people with COVID who were not very ill, young people. The people who were severely ill were either older people with serious chronic disease, many coming by ambulance from nursing homes, or younger people, generally with severe obesity and the consequences of that, like type 2 diabetes. And we also had difficulty. We'd already figured out, or I should say, the medical system had figured out, because I get no credit for this. I just walked into it. But by the time I was deployed in April of last year, it was already common knowledge that putting people with COVID on the ventilator was a bad thing, that things tended to go south, but that you could actually improve oxygenation with repositioning. So that was routine. And many people who would have been put on ventilators just the week before, by the time I went to the Bronx, were not being put on ventilators, just they were being repositioned, and we watched their oxygen levels improve right before our eyes. But that was much harder with somebody who was really big, because after all, I mean, they were on a gurney in the emergency department. They were kind of wedged in there, and it was harder for them to move, and it was harder for the staff to turn them. So they were being turned less often and less effectively. So there was a direct mechanical disadvantage. It wasn't just metabolic. So, you know, the mechanisms of this were on display when I was there rendering care. And I made a very modest contribution to the front lines, and I was glad to do it. I just felt like I should do my part. So, you know, informed by all of this, we did another paper where we estimated that more than 40% of all hospitalizations for COVID in the US could have been prevented if we had simply addressed these modifiable conditions we've long known how to fix. But then we were done one better. This is again, Dariush Mozaffarian is the senior author, and others in this paper in the Journal of the American Heart Association. So here they looked at a wider array of cardiometabolic conditions and estimated that more than 60% of the hospitalizations in the US for COVID were avoidable. Not by avoiding COVID, maybe we could have done that better too, that's another topic, but by fixing cardiometabolic issues related to diet and lifestyle. And again, just to remind you where we are in the talk, I'm simply making clear what diet could do, how critically important it is. And I am making the acute case for chronic health. Now, we usually, in my field, preventive medicine, lifestyle medicine, you know, we're talking about take good care of yourself now and you'll avoid bad things in the future. Yeah, but during a pandemic, the future is next week. You know, we're not just talking about delayed gratification. Oops, sorry, bit of mayhem in the background. We're not just talking about avoid, you know, heart disease, diabetes in the future. We're talking about the immediate protection conferred by better cardiometabolic health during the pandemic. So imagine if 60% of hospitalization had been avoided, that of course would have meant 60% less mortality. I mean, that's massive. That totally changes the scope of the pandemic. We had this opportunity. So I've made the case in my own writing that two pandemics are actually better than one. If SARS-CoV-2 was a one-size-fits-all scourge, in other words, no matter what your health was, you're equally likely to get really sick and die, you know, then all we could do is stay away from the virus and wait for the vaccine. But if that's not true, and it's not true, we also have the opportunity to address these other pandemics, make ourselves healthier, which, by the way, is the gift that keeps on giving, because that will be advantageous long after SARS-CoV-2, you know, it has receded into epidemiologic background, but it will protect us acutely as well. So two pandemics create an opportunity that one does not, because fixing one is the best defense against the other. I created this color-coded grid early on. Red is bad, that's high risk. So if you're elderly and chronically ill, you're at very high risk of bad outcomes. As you move from red to yellow to green, things improve. If you're young and healthy, you're at very low risk. But the white arrows are what interest me most as a preventive medicine, lifestyle medicine specialist. Those are the opportunities we had and arguably still have to take people from higher risk tiers into lower risk tiers. And this is what health promotion, disease prevention, programming could do. All right, well, that'll do the acute and chronic case for how powerful diet is, how important diet is, what diet can do. What I haven't answered yet is what diet can do all of that. And of course, many of you have very strong opinions on this topic. I'm not going to say anything that's going to shock you. So I suspect here we fall into the space where you're just going to nod your heads and say, yeah, we already knew that. But let's start with these pithy 7 words from Michael Pollan, so well known, and probably the most famous adage about eating well in the modern era: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And what Pollan means by food is real food, not hyper-processed, glow-in-the-dark Frankenfood, so food direct from nature. The not too much is certainly important in a world awash in obesity, but you don't really need to focus on that, because if you eat real food, the not too much takes care of itself. And I'll come back to that in a little while when I talk about another Michael Moss. And mostly plants, because Pollan is not ideological on this. It's clear that all good diets are plant predominant. This is an audience that's likely to favor plant exclusive, and plant exclusive is a variant on the theme of plant predominant. So this may be more of a rising tide that can lift all boats, but it certainly does not in any way preclude being plant exclusive. But all good diets are plant predominant diets, and most modern diets are animal food predominant, and that means they're broken and need to be fixed. And Pollan basically got it right. Every time I've looked at this issue, and I've spent a career looking at this issue, I've reached exactly that same conclusion. Did a review article for Annual Reviews of Public Health in 2014. Can we say what diet is best for health? Looked at an extensive span in the literature, and the theme of feeding Homo sapiens well is a diet of real food, and mostly, if not only, minimally processed vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, seeds, and plain water when thirsty. And the simple fact is that if you get that right, if your diet really is predominantly vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, and plain water for thirst, you can't go too far wrong, because whatever else you do is a very small contributor to your diet. If you don't get that right, whatever else you do is unlikely to make much difference, because the fundamentals of your dietary pattern are off the theme that's good for our kind of animal. And I might as well throw that into the mix again. I mentioned it before. We are a kind of animal. We tend to forget that. There's sort of a Homo sapien arrogance that makes us talk about nature and us as if we're separate things. Of course, we're not separate things. We are a kind of animal. And think for a minute about the fact that every other kind of animal has a way that it ought to eat. Right? So, we cannot expect lions to eat grass. Lions need to eat wildebeest. They are obligate carnivores. Wildebeest need to eat grass. If in a zoo you gave grass to the lions and meat to the wildebeest, they would both die. So how an animal needs to eat, what it's adapted to eat, is always relevant. And by the way, usually zookeepers do not run randomized controlled trials. They don't try the lions on grass and then say, no, that didn't work well, let's try something else. They feed animals in accord with their obvious adaptations and native requirements. It's very useful when we think about ourselves to think about the kind of animal we are. If you can join what we know from modern science with what we know about every other species, the fact that its anatomy, its physiology tell you a lot about how it needs to eat, the answer is perfectly clear. And there really should be much less debate than we see on display. I have devoted countless hours and years to this issue, and as kindly mentioned during the introduction, I've written 19 books to date, many of them textbooks, including Nutrition and Clinical Practice. We're just wrapping up the 4th edition now. We've turned in 52 chapters across an expanse of 750 pages and 10,000 citations. So this is a textbook on nutrition for health professionals, and we just updated it. And once again, the conclusion is that for human health, diets need to be based on real food, not frankenfood, and plant predominant. And that reverberates through all of my other writing, including the books available in the bookstore here, The Truth About Food. And by the way, all proceeds from that one go to support the True Health Initiative, a 501c3. And then the book I was recently privileged to do with Mark Bittman, How to Eat. And of course, I have the best of company, along with many of the other speakers at this conference. A who's who in nutrition has weighed in on this topic. What do we know about optimal dietary patterns for every aspect of human health? From Dariush Mozaffarian to Jim Mann to Frank Hugh, who's now chair of nutrition at Harvard, and many, many others. And the conclusions are incredibly consistent and clear. And they reverberate around the world. Our dietary guidelines in the US are not really all that unique. And leaving aside the flaws in the dietary guidelines, and yes, there are significant flaws, by all means, bring that up in the Q&A. We can get back into it. My point here is simply that the fundamentals, encouraging people to eat more fruits and vegetables and whole grains rather than refined grains, and cut back on meat, which is prominent in other dietary guidelines, not as prominent as it should be in the US, but that's in dietary guidelines all around the world. And what makes this important is these are very diverse cultures, but we are all the same kind of animal. We're one great big species. We're a big human family. It makes sense that, yes, you can apply an ethnic or cultural overlay and eat the way you want to eat, but the fundamentals are the fundamentals. They're rooted in biology, not culture. They don't change. And these dietary guidelines in very diverse cultures reflect that. And I very much like the example of the blue zones. I trust you're all very familiar with the blue zones, those 5 places around the world, identified for us by National Geographic fellow Dan Buettner, where people most routinely live to be 100 and don't get chronic disease. In Ikaria, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, Okinawa, Japan, Loma Linda, California, and the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica. And in the world's blue zones, we could take a look at dietary patterns on a spectrum from animal food predominant to plant food predominant, AFP to PFP, and from ultra-processed food predominant to real food predominant, UFP to RFP. And interesting to note that the blue zones all cluster on the right side of the spectrum. They all eat real food, and they all have plant food predominant diets. Now, they're not all vegan. There are quite a few vegans in Loma Linda. There are maybe some in Okinawa, but in Okinawa, they eat a little bit of fish and seafood. In Costa Rica, they have an omnivorous diet. They eat mostly wild meat. They do some hunting. It's very limited, but it's not a plant food exclusive diet. The 2 Mediterranean countries involved, Greece and Italy, those diets are not plant food exclusive either. But the thing that makes them alike is the plant food predominance. So they differ what's included, whether there's dairy or not. There's some dairy, obviously, in the Mediterranean diets. There's none in the Okinawan diet. So, if you want to look at these diets through the lens that clarifies, okay, what matters? If all these populations live to be 100, if all of them have remarkably low rates of chronic disease, it's what their diets have in common that's the active ingredient. And the active ingredient is vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds every time. That evidence matters.